Ad hominem. Imagine a courtroom where instead of examining evidence, the prosecutor stands up and declares the defendant unworthy of belief simply because of who they are. This is the essence of the ad hominem fallacy, perhaps the most visceral and immediately satisfying of all logical errors. The term literally means to the person in Latin, and it represents humanity's ancient tendency to attack the messenger rather than engage with the message. When we deploy ad hominem, we're essentially saying that a person's character, background, or affiliations automatically invalidate their arguments, regardless of the merit of what they're actually saying. This fallacy operates on a fundamental misunderstanding of how truth works. Truth doesn't care about its source. A mathematical theorem remains valid whether it's discovered by a Nobel laureate or a high school dropout. A logical argument maintains its structure, whether it comes from a saint or a sinner. Yet ad hominem attacks exploit our deeply ingrained social instincts, our evolutionary programming that tells us to trust some people and distrust others based on tribal affiliations and social hierarchies. What makes ad hominem particularly dangerous is its emotional efficiency. Constructing a thoughtful response to a complex argument requires mental energy, time, and expertise. Pointing out that someone is hypocritical, immoral, or simply unlikable requires none of these. It's the intellectual equivalent of junk food immediately satisfying, but ultimately nutritionally vacant. The fallacy manifests in countless forms across our modern landscape. In politics, it transforms policy debates into character assassinations. In science, it turns methodological discussions into attacks on researchers' funding sources or institutional affiliations. In personal relationships, it converts disagreements about specific issues into broader indictments of someone's worth as a human being. Yet perhaps the most insidious aspect of ad hominem is how it creates a kind of intellectual arms race. Once one side abandons the substance of an argument to attack the person making it, the other side feels justified in responding in kind. Soon, the original issue becomes entirely forgotten, buried beneath layers of personal animosity and character assassination. The tragedy of ad hominem is that it often works precisely because it feels so satisfying. There's a primal pleasure in watching someone we dislike get taken down, even if the takedown has nothing to do with whether they're right or wrong about the issue at hand. This emotional payoff makes ad hominem attacks viral in ways that careful, nuanced arguments rarely achieve. The Strawman Fallacy. In medieval training yards, knights would practice their sword work against straw-filled dummies, predictable, immobile targets that offered no real resistance. The Strawman Fallacy operates on the same principle, except instead of practicing combat, we're practicing intellectual dishonesty. When someone commits the Strawman Fallacy, they replace their opponent's actual position with a distorted, exaggerated, or completely fabricated version that's much easier to attack. It's the rhetorical equivalent of claiming victory after defeating an army of scarecrows while the real battle rages elsewhere. This fallacy represents one of the most sophisticated forms of intellectual misdirection. Unlike the blunt force of ad hominem attacks, strawman arguments require a certain artistry. The perpetrator must understand the original position well enough to create a plausible distortion, then execute the substitution so smoothly that observers might not notice the switch has occurred. The psychology behind strawman attacks reveals something profound about human cognition. Our brains are pattern-matching machines, constantly seeking to categorize new information into existing mental frameworks. The Strawman Fallacy exploits this tendency by offering a simplified version of complex ideas that fits neatly into our preconceived notions about what those people believe. Consider how this plays out in the ecosystem of modern discourse. Complex policy proposals with nuanced provisions and careful balancing of competing interests get reduced to caricatures that sound absurd or extreme. Philosophical positions developed over centuries of careful thought get compressed into sound bites that miss their essential subtlety. Scientific theories built on mountains of evidence get portrayed as wild speculation or dogmatic belief. The strawman fallacy is particularly dangerous because it's often committed unconsciously. The person creating the strawman may genuinely believe they're accurately representing their opponent's position. This happens because of a cognitive bias called the hostile attribution bias, our tendency to interpret ambiguous statements from people we disagree with in the least charitable way possible. What makes strawman arguments so persistent is their asymmetrical nature. It takes far more time and energy to explain why a strawman is inaccurate than it does to create one in the first place. The original arguer finds themselves in the exhausting position of constantly clarifying what they actually believe, rather than defending it, while the strawman creator gets to keep attacking easy targets. The internet has weaponized the strawman fallacy in unprecedented ways. Social media algorithms reward content that generates strong emotional responses, and strawman arguments excel at producing outrage. Screenshotable quotes taken out of context, simplified memes that reduce complex positions to absurdity, and the echo chamber effect that amplifies the most extreme versions of opposing viewpoints. All of these create an environment where strawman arguments flourish while nuanced discussion withers. Circular reasoning. Picture an ancient serpent eating its own tail, locked in an endless cycle of self-consumption. This mythological image of the Ouroboros perfectly captures the essence of circular reasoning, a logical fallacy that creates the illusion of proof while actually proving nothing at all. Circular reasoning occurs when the conclusion of an argument is also used as one of its premises. It's like trying to lift yourself off the ground by pulling on your own bootstraps. No matter how much effort you exert, you haven't actually added any external force to the system. In logical terms, you haven't provided any independent evidence for your conclusion. You've simply restated it in different words. The insidious nature of circular reasoning lies in its ability to feel logically satisfying while being completely empty of actual content. Our brains are wired to find coherent, internally consistent narratives compelling, even when those narratives don't connect to external reality. Circular arguments exploit this tendency by creating a closed loop of reasoning that feels complete and self-sufficient. This fallacy manifests across every domain of human thought. In religious discussions, sacred texts are often cited as proof of their own divine authority. In ideological debates, political philosophies are defended using principles that are themselves derived from those same philosophies. In scientific contexts, theories sometimes become so entrenched that they're used to interpret evidence that would otherwise challenge them. What makes circular reasoning particularly dangerous is its resistance to external critique. Because the argument forms a closed logical system, challenges from outside can be deflected by appealing to the internal consistency of the reasoning. Critics find themselves in the frustrating position of trying to break into a self-reinforcing cycle that has no natural entry points for external evidence or alternative perspectives. The digital age has created new and sophisticated forms of circular reasoning through the phenomenon of information bubbles and echo chambers. When we primarily consume information from sources that already agree with our beliefs, we create environments where our assumptions are constantly being cited as evidence for our conclusions, and our conclusions are used to justify our assumptions. Social media algorithms amplify this effect by showing us content that confirms what we already think, creating the illusion that our circular reasoning is actually supported by a wealth of independent evidence. Academic disciplines sometimes fall into collective circular reasoning when paradigms become so dominant that they shape not just how evidence is interpreted, but what counts as legitimate evidence in the first place. Peer review processes, grant funding decisions, and publication opportunities can all become skewed toward research that supports existing theoretical frameworks, making it extremely difficult for genuinely revolutionary ideas to gain traction. The psychological appeal of circular reasoning stems from its promise of certainty in an uncertain world. Linear reasoning that depends on external evidence always carries the risk that new information will force us to revise our beliefs. Circular reasoning offers the seductive possibility of beliefs that are immune to challenge because they generate their own justification. This false sense of security can be psychologically addictive, leading people to become increasingly invested in maintaining the integrity of their circular systems rather than subjecting them to external scrutiny. To Quoque. In the ancient Roman courts, Defendants would sometimes respond to accusations not by denying their guilt, but by pointing out that their accusers were equally guilty of the same crimes. This deflection tactic became known as tu quoque, Latin for you too, and it remains one of the most psychologically compelling fallacies in the human arsenal of flawed reasoning. The tu quoque fallacy operates on a simple but seductive principle. If you're guilty of something, you forfeit the right to criticize others for the same behavior. At first glance, this seems almost reasonable after all. Isn't there something unsettling about hypocrisy? Shouldn't people practice what they preach before they start preaching to others? But this intuitive appeal masks a fundamental logical error. The truth of a statement has absolutely no relationship to the moral consistency of the person making it. A smoker's warning about the dangers of cigarettes doesn't become medically inaccurate simply because they haven't quit yet. A corrupt politician's criticism of corruption in others doesn't magically transform corruption into a virtue. Tu quoque thrives in the fertile ground of human moral psychology. We have deep-seated instincts about fairness and reciprocity that make hypocrisy feel like a cardinal sin. When someone violates these expectations, our emotional response can be so strong that it overwhelms our logical faculties. The righteous indignation we feel toward hypocrites provides such satisfying psychological release that we mistake it for a valid form of reasoning. This fallacy has found its perfect ecosystem in our modern media landscape. Political discourse, in particular, has become an endless cycle of tu quoque attacks. Rather than engaging with policy proposals on their merits, opposing sides spend their time excavating past statements and actions that reveal inconsistencies in their opponent's positions. The goal isn't to determine what's true or what policies would be most beneficial, it's to demonstrate that the other side has no moral authority to make their case. The internet has supercharged tu quoque by creating permanent, searchable records of everything anyone has ever said or done. A politician who changes their position based on new evidence gets accused of flip-flopping. An activist who lives in a way that's inconsistent with their stated values gets branded a hypocrite. The result is a chilling effect on both intellectual honesty and moral leadership. People become afraid to advocate for positions they can't personally embody perfectly. What makes tu quoque particularly insidious is how it can be deployed defensively to avoid accountability. Instead of addressing legitimate criticism, the accused party can simply point to similar flaws in their critics. This creates an infinite regression where no one is ever required to actually address the substance of ethical concerns, because everyone can find someone else who's also imperfect. The fallacy also exploits our natural tendency toward moral relativism in interpersonal conflicts. When we're confronted with our own shortcomings, it's psychologically easier to expand the circle of blame than to accept responsibility. Tu quoque provides a perfect mechanism for this expansion. It transforms personal accountability into a universal human condition, where everyone is equally guilty and therefore no one is particularly culpable. Appeal to emotion. Logic crumbles when emotion takes the wheel. The appeal to emotion fallacy weaponizes our feelings, substituting tears, anger, or fear for evidence and reason. This manipulation technique bypasses our analytical minds, speaking directly to our primitive responses, the same ones that once kept our ancestors alive, but now leave us vulnerable to those who would exploit them. Charitable organizations perfected this approach long ago. The advertisement shows a single suffering child, eyes wide, belly distended. Statistics about millions in need remain abstract, but this one face breaks through our defenses. Our wallets open not because we've evaluated the charity's effectiveness or administrative overhead, but because we cannot bear the weight of those eyes. The emotion becomes the argument. Politicians wield fear like a surgeon's scalpel, precise and devastating. Crime statistics might show historic lows, but one brutal incident, properly packaged, overrides decades of data. The candidate who promises safety from the manufactured threat wins over the one citing improvement trends. Parents clutch their children tighter, vote for harsher measures, support policies they would reject in calmer moments. Fear doesn't require facts, it only needs fertile ground. Marketing transformed this fallacy into an art form. The car commercial doesn't list specifications or safety ratings. Instead, it shows a father driving his daughter to her wedding, both of them crying. The watch advertisement ignores precision engineering, focusing on a grandfather passing his timepiece to his grandson. We buy the emotion, not the product. We purchase membership in the feeling, not ownership of the object. The tragedy lies in how this fallacy corrupts important discussions. Climate change debates devolve into pictures of polar bears on shrinking ice versus images of unemployed coal miners. Healthcare reform gets buried under stories of individual tragedies from both sides. The emotional ammunition flies, while substantive policy discussion dies in the crossfire. We make civilization-altering decisions based on which story made us cry harder. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this, the post hoc fallacy represents humanity's most fundamental confusion about cause and effect. Two events occur in sequence, and our pattern-hungry brains immediately forge a causal link. The rooster crows, then the sun rises. The rooster must summon the dawn. This error in reasoning has shaped superstitions, destroyed reputations, and misdirected resources throughout human history. Sports fans embody this fallacy with religious fervor. The team wins while someone wears their lucky socks. Those socks become sacred, unwashed talismans of victory. The correlation transforms into causation in their minds. They ignore the hundreds of variables that actually influence game outcomes: player health, strategic decisions, opponent weaknesses. The socks receive credit that belongs to athletes and coaches. Economic discussions drown in post hoc reasoning. A new president takes office, and 6 months later, unemployment drops. Their supporters claim victory for policies that haven't had time to take effect. Their opponents point to negative indicators that emerged during the same period, equally eager to assign blame. Both sides ignore the complex machinery of economics, the long lag times between policy and result, the countless factors beyond any politician's control. Medical understanding suffered centuries of post hoc confusion. Bloodletting appeared to cure certain patients, those who would have recovered anyway. The treatment received credit for the body's natural healing. Countless patients died from this misattribution, bled to death by physicians convinced of their cure's efficacy. Only controlled studies finally broke the post hoc spell, revealing that sequence does not equal consequence. The fallacy persists because it offers comfort in an uncertain world. Random events become manageable when we assign them causes, even false ones. The alternative, acknowledging the chaos, the complexity, the limits of our control, proves too unsettling for many. So we cling to our lucky pennies, our rain dances, our false correlations, choosing the illusion of understanding over the discomfort of ignorance. Red herring. In the world of logical fallacies, the red herring stands out as perhaps the most theatrical. Like a master magician who directs the audience's attention away from where the real trick is happening, the red herring fallacy succeeds through pure misdirection, leading discussions away from relevant issues toward irrelevant but emotionally compelling distractions. The name itself comes from a practice used in training hunting dogs. Strong-smelling red herrings would be dragged across the path to test whether the hounds could stay focused on their original quarry or would be led astray by the more pungent but irrelevant scent. In the realm of human reasoning, red herrings serve the same function. They test our ability to maintain focus on the actual issue at hand when faced with more immediately engaging distractions. Red herring fallacies operate through a sophisticated understanding of human psychology. They exploit our natural tendency to follow whatever conversational thread seems most emotionally engaging, regardless of its relevance to the original question. The person deploying a red herring doesn't need to win the original argument. They just need to successfully change the subject to terrain where they feel more comfortable or where their opponent is less prepared. This fallacy requires a certain strategic intelligence that distinguishes it from other forms of flawed reasoning. While many fallacies emerge from genuine confusion or cognitive limitations, red herrings are often deployed deliberately by people who understand exactly what they're doing. They represent a conscious choice to abandon intellectual honesty in favor of rhetorical advantage. The modern information environment has created ideal conditions for red herring tactics to flourish. In political debates, complex policy discussions regularly get derailed by irrelevant personal anecdotes, historical tangents, or emotionally charged but peripheral issues. Cable news programs routinely use breaking news alerts and dramatic graphics to redirect attention from substantive analysis toward whatever story is generating the most immediate viewer engagement. Social media platforms have weaponized the red herring by making it incredibly easy to introduce new topics into ongoing conversations. A discussion about healthcare policy can be instantly derailed by someone introducing a completely unrelated cultural controversy. The fast-paced, attention-deficit nature of online discourse rewards these kinds of topic shifts because they generate more engagement than sustained, focused discussion. What makes red herrings particularly frustrating is how they exploit our politeness instincts. When someone introduces what appears to be a relevant concern, social norms dictate that we should address it before returning to the original topic. But by the time we've dealt with the distraction, the conversation has moved on, and the original issue remains unresolved. The red herring succeeds not by winning the argument, but by preventing the argument from happening at all. The fallacy also takes advantage of our limited cognitive resources. Human attention is finite, and every moment spent chasing irrelevant tangents is a moment not spent on productive analysis. Over time, repeated exposure to red herring tactics can create a kind of intellectual exhaustion where people give up trying to have focused discussions altogether. Perhaps most insidiously, red herrings can be deployed preemptively to prevent certain topics from ever being seriously discussed. By consistently introducing distractions whenever particular subjects arise, skilled practitioners of this fallacy can effectively place entire areas of inquiry off-limits without ever having to explicitly refuse to engage with them. Gambler's Fallacy. The Gambler's Fallacy reveals our fundamental misunderstanding of probability and randomness. We imagine that past events influence future probabilities in independent situations. The roulette wheel lands on red 5 times consecutively, so black must be due. The dice haven't shown 6 recently, so 6 becomes more likely. This fallacy has emptied bank accounts and ruined lives, all in service to a misunderstanding of mathematical reality. Casinos profit enormously from this cognitive error. The displays showing recent roulette results aren't there for record-keeping. They're there to trigger the gambler's fallacy. Players see patterns where none exist, divine meaning from randomness. They increase their bets, certain that probability owes them a reversal. The wheel has no memory, the dice hold no grudges, but the human mind cannot accept this independence. The fallacy extends beyond gambling into everyday decision-making. Couples with 3 daughters convince themselves the 4th child must be a son. Probability demands it. The universe doesn't keep score. Each conception carries the same roughly 50-50 odds regardless of previous outcomes. But the feeling of being due for a different result overwhelms mathematical reality. Investment decisions fall prey to this fallacy regularly. A stock declined for 6 straight days, so tomorrow it must rise. A fund manager beat the market 3 years running, so this year they must fail. These beliefs drive buying and selling decisions worth billions, all based on the false premise that random events self-correct, that luck maintains balance sheets. Market movements have reasons, but evening out isn't among them. The fallacy persists because humans excel at pattern recognition too much so. Our ancestors survived by identifying real patterns in nature, predicting weather from clouds, danger from sounds. But this ability becomes liability when applied to truly random events. We see faces in television static, meanings in coincidence, patterns in chaos. The gambler's fallacy represents our pattern-seeking gone haywire, finding order where only randomness exists. Appeal to authority. The appeal to authority fallacy corrupts our necessary reliance on expertise. We cannot all be experts in everything, so we must trust those with specialized knowledge. But this fallacy stretches that reasonable trust into unreasonable territory, treating experts as infallible oracles whose opinions override evidence and logic. It transforms healthy respect for knowledge into unhealthy worship of credentials. Celebrity endorsements exemplify this fallacy's commercial application. The Academy Award winner promotes cryptocurrency investments. The Olympic athlete sells nutritional supplements. Their excellence in one narrow field supposedly grants them wisdom in all fields. Millions make financial decisions based on dramatic talent, health choices based on athletic ability. The non sequitur goes unnoticed beneath the glow of fame. Scientific discussions suffer when this fallacy replaces evidence with eminence. A Nobel laureate in physics expresses opinions about biology, and their Nobel becomes a universal certificate of correctness. They might be completely wrong about evolution or vaccines, but their authority in one domain gets transferred wholesale to another. The media amplifies this effect, seeking quotes from famous scientists rather than relevant experts. Historical examples reveal this fallacy's deadly potential. Physicians once rejected hand-washing because respected medical authorities declared it unnecessary. Established astronomers dismissed continental drift because geological luminaries mocked the theory. The appeal to authority delayed medical advances, scientific discoveries, social progress. Humanity paid in lives and ignorance for our excessive deference to incumbent experts. The fallacy becomes particularly dangerous when authorities speak beyond their evidence. An expert's educated guess receives the same weight as their proven findings. Their personal opinions get treated as professional consensus. Their tentative hypotheses transform into absolute truths in the retelling. The careful qualifications and uncertainties that mark genuine expertise disappear, leaving only the false certainty that the fallacy demands. Bandwagon Fallacy. Somewhere in our evolutionary past, following the crowd was often a matter of life and death. When the majority of your tribe suddenly started running in one direction, stopping to carefully evaluate the logic of their decision could mean being trampled by a stampede or eaten by a predator. This ancient survival mechanism has left us with a powerful psychological bias toward conformity, one that the bandwagon fallacy ruthlessly exploits. The bandwagon fallacy, also known as argumentum ad populum, operates on the false premise that popularity equals truth. It suggests that if a large number of people believe something, that belief must be correct. This seems almost reasonable until you remember that popular opinion once supported the idea that the earth was flat, that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones, and that washing hands before surgery was unnecessary. What makes the bandwagon fallacy so powerful is how it taps into multiple psychological vulnerabilities simultaneously. There's our fear of social exclusion, the deep-seated anxiety that disagreeing with the majority will lead to isolation and rejection. There's our cognitive laziness, the appeal of adopting beliefs without having to do the difficult work of independent evaluation. And there's our misunderstanding of probability, the intuitive but incorrect assumption that if many people independently arrive at the same conclusion, it's more likely to be true. Modern society has created unprecedented opportunities for bandwagon effects to emerge and spread. Social media platforms provide real-time feedback about which ideas are gaining popularity through likes, shares, and trending topics. This constant stream of social proof can make minority viewpoints feel not just unpopular but actually wrong. The algorithms that govern these platforms amplify popular content, creating feedback loops where initial popularity leads to greater visibility, which leads to even more popularity. The fallacy becomes particularly dangerous in contexts where popularity and truth are most likely to diverge. Financial markets, for instance, are notorious for creating bubbles where the collective belief that prices will continue rising becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy until it suddenly isn't. Political movements can gain momentum through bandwagon effects that have little to do with the actual merit of their policies. Consumer trends can sweep through populations based on social contagion rather than product quality. What's especially insidious about the bandwagon fallacy is how it can co-opt legitimate decision-making strategies. In situations with limited information, looking to the behavior of others can actually be rational, a phenomenon psychologists call social proof. The challenge lies in distinguishing between situations where following the crowd makes sense and situations where it's simply an abdication of critical thinking, cherry-picking. Cherry-picking represents intellectual dishonesty at its most refined. This fallacy selects only the evidence supporting a predetermined conclusion while ignoring contradicting data. It harvests the sweet fruit of confirmation, while leaving the bitter fruit of refutation to rot unseen. Through selective presentation, any position becomes defensible, any theory provable. Climate change debates showcase cherry-picking from all sides. Skeptics highlight the medieval warm period while ignoring current warming's unprecedented rate. They cite cold snaps as disproving global warming while dismissing heat records. Advocates sometimes cherry-pick too, emphasizing worst-case scenarios while downplaying uncertainty. Both sides harvest the data that serves their narrative, leaving full understanding to wither. Pharmaceutical companies perfected cherry-picking into corporate art. They conduct multiple studies, then publish only the positive results. The drug appears effective because failures remain hidden in filing cabinets. They highlight beneficial effects while minimizing side effects, emphasize relative risk reduction while obscuring absolute numbers. The cherry-picked presentation creates medications that seem miraculous until the full data emerges. Historical arguments rely heavily on cherry-picking. Every nation's history contains nobility and atrocity, triumph and shame. The nationalist cherry-picks the glory while ignoring the horror. The critic cherry-picks the crimes while dismissing the contributions. Both construct narratives from selective facts, creating histories that would be unrecognizable to those who lived them. The past becomes propaganda through strategic selection. Social media amplifies cherry-picking exponentially. Algorithms feed us information confirming our beliefs while filtering out challenges. We share studies supporting our views while scrolling past contradictions. Our feeds become galleries of cherry-picked reality where our prejudices always find support. The marketplace of ideas becomes a series of echo chambers, each selecting different cherries from the same tree of knowledge. The Nirvana Fallacy. The Nirvana Fallacy rejects real improvements because they fall short of imaginary perfection. It compares actual options against impossible ideals rather than against each other. This fallacy makes the perfect the enemy of the good, the ideal the assassin of the better. It paralyzes progress by demanding destinations we cannot reach, dismissing steps forward as inadequate because they aren't leaps to paradise. Public policy debates showcase Nirvana thinking constantly. A proposed healthcare reform would help millions, but not everyone. The Nirvana Fallacy rejects it for falling short of universal perfect care. A crime reduction program would save lives but not eliminate all crime. The fallacy dismisses it as failure because utopia remains distant. Every improvement gets measured against perfection rather than the status quo. Personal decisions fall prey to Nirvana paralysis. The exercise routine that would improve health gets abandoned because it won't create Olympic athletes. The diet that would help gets rejected for not guaranteeing ideal weight. The relationship that would bring happiness gets spurned for falling short of fairy tales. The Nirvana Fallacy makes us choose nothing over something, preferring theoretical perfection to actual improvement. Technology discussions exemplify this impossibilist standard. Electric vehicles reduce emissions but aren't zero impact. Renewable energy helps but isn't perfectly clean. Nuclear power could help but isn't risk-free. The Nirvana Fallacy rejects each option for imperfection while offering no path to its impossible standard. It criticizes every solution while solving nothing, demands perfection while delivering paralysis. The fallacy derives power from our ability to imagine perfection without achieving it. We can envision ideal worlds, perfect systems, flawless solutions. These mental constructs become clubs for beating actual proposals. The Nirvana Fallacy mistakes imagination for option, treating impossible ideals as available alternatives. It forgets that choosing requires selecting among actual options, not comparing reality to dreams. Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy. The Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy draws targets around bullet holes, creating the illusion of accuracy where only randomness exists. Named for the imaginary gunman who shoots randomly at a barn then paints bullseyes around the clusters, this fallacy finds patterns in randomness, significance in coincidence. It transforms statistical noise into meaningful signal through selective attention and retrospective interpretation. Cancer cluster investigations often reveal this fallacy in action. A neighborhood experiences several cancer cases. Residents identify a nearby power plant, cell tower, or chemical facility as the obvious cause. They draw their target around the cluster, ignoring the thousands of similar facilities near neighborhoods without elevated cancer rates. Random variation becomes sinister pattern through selective focus. The genuine environmental hazards get lost in the noise of false correlations. Financial advisors exploit this fallacy magnificently. They highlight their successful predictions while memory holing their failures. The 3 accurate market calls become proof of prescient wisdom. The 37 wrong calls vanish from the narrative. They paint their bullseye around their hits, creating an image of consistency from a record of randomness. Clients see patterns of success where only selective reporting exists. Prophecy and prediction thrive on Texas sharpshooter thinking. The vague prediction that a leader will fall gets claimed as success when any politician anywhere faces scandal. The psychic's dozen guesses yield one match, which becomes the evidence of supernatural power. The failed predictions disappear while the single success gets enshrined. The target forms around whatever random hit occurs. Scientific research suffers when this fallacy influences data analysis. Researchers collect vast amounts of data, then search for any correlation that reaches statistical significance. They test hundreds of hypotheses simultaneously, then report only the positive results. The pattern they find might be real, or might be random noise that happened to align with their search. Without pre-registration of hypotheses, science becomes sharpshooting, finding patterns rather than testing predictions. Appeal to ignorance. The appeal to ignorance fallacy transforms absence of evidence into evidence of absence or presence. It argues that something must be true because it hasn't been proven false, or false because it hasn't been proven true. This fallacy weaponizes the gaps in our knowledge, turning uncertainty into false certainty. It thrives in the shadows of what we don't yet know. Conspiracy theories feast on appeals to ignorance. No one can prove the government doesn't have alien technology, therefore they must have it. No evidence exists of the secret society's non-existence, so it must exist. The burden of proof gets reversed. Instead of requiring evidence for extraordinary claims, the fallacy demands evidence against them. The unfalsifiable becomes the unquestionable. Religious and atheistic arguments both fall into this trap. Some believers argue that science cannot disprove God, therefore God exists. Some atheists argue that believers cannot prove God, therefore God doesn't exist. Both commit the appeal to ignorance, treating lack of conclusive evidence as conclusive evidence of lack. The mystery remains mysterious, but both sides claim false certainty from the uncertainty. Medical quackery thrives on this fallacy. The alternative treatment hasn't been proven not to work, so desperate patients embrace it. The fact that no mechanism explains how diluted water could cure disease becomes irrelevant. Science hasn't proven it impossible, so it must be possible. The appeal to ignorance transforms lack of disproof into proof, absence of rejection into acceptance. The fallacy particularly corrupts discussions about future risks. We cannot prove that artificial intelligence won't become dangerous, so some argue it definitely will. We cannot prove that genetic modification won't have unexpected consequences, so opponents insist disaster awaits. The unknown becomes the assumed, the unproven becomes the certain. Reasonable caution transforms into paralytic fear or reckless abandon, depending on which direction the appeal to ignorance points. False precision. False precision masquerades uncertainty as exactitude, dressing guesswork in mathematical costume. This fallacy presents approximate knowledge with inappropriate accuracy, implying understanding where only estimation exists. It transforms rough calculations into precise predictions, general trends into specific numbers. The decimal points multiply while actual knowledge remains unchanged. Economic forecasting exemplifies false precision perfectly. Analysts predict GDP growth to the second decimal place 3 years forward. They cannot possibly know economic conditions. With such accuracy, wars might start, pandemics might emerge, innovations might disrupt. But 2.34% sounds more authoritative than roughly 2-3%. The false precision implies knowledge that cannot exist, confidence that shouldn't be held. Polling data drowns in false precision. A survey of 1,000 people generates percentages to the decimal point, margins of error to precise degrees. The poll claims 48.6% support with a 3.2% margin of error. But response bias, question wording, sampling issues introduce uncertainties far exceeding these precise claims. The mathematical precision obscures the methodological imprecision. Numbers that seem scientific mask processes that aren't. Nutritional science suffers from false precision. Daily recommended values get stated to the gram, calorie counts to the unit. But individual metabolism varies enormously. Food composition changes with preparation. Absorption depends on countless factors. The precision implies universal applicability, where only general guidelines exist. People make dietary decisions based on false precision that ignores biological complexity. Risk assessment particularly abuses false precision. Security experts calculate terrorism risk to multiple decimal places. Environmental scientists present extinction probabilities with percentage precision. These numbers result from chains of assumptions, each containing uncertainty. Multiplying uncertain estimates doesn't create certain results, but false precision pretends otherwise. The specific number replaces the honest range. False certainty substitutes for acknowledged ignorance. Appeal to money. The appeal to money fallacy equates financial success with truth, profitability with correctness. It assumes that wealth validates ideas, that market value measures actual value. This fallacy transforms economic outcomes into epistemic authorities, treating dollars as votes for veracity. The rich become right by virtue of their riches. The profitable becomes proper through its profits. Business literature swims in appeals to money. The billionaire's autobiography becomes wisdom literature regardless of luck's role in their success. Their opinions on education, politics, philosophy receive weight proportional to their wealth rather than their expertise. The successful startup founder becomes guru on all subjects. Money makes them smart retroactively. Success makes them sage automatically. Entertainment industries embody this fallacy. The highest-grossing movie must be the best movie. The best-selling book deserves literary praise. Commercial success becomes artistic merit through the alchemy of appeal to money. Critics who note that popularity and quality diverge get dismissed as elitists. The box office becomes the ultimate critic, the sales chart, the final arbiter of worth. Technology discussions particularly fall prey to this fallacy. The profitable platform must be the superior platform. The valuable company must produce value. Market capitalization becomes the measure of innovation. Stock price, the score of significance. Companies bleeding money while destroying industries get celebrated for their valuations. The appeal to money mistakes price for worth, cost for value. The fallacy corrupts political discourse profoundly. Policies get evaluated by their effect on GDP rather than human welfare. Countries get ranked by economic size rather than citizen satisfaction. The assumption that wealth equals well-being pervades discussions, making money the measure of all things. Quality of life becomes subordinate to quantity of dollars. The appeal to money reduces human flourishing to financial figures. Hasty generalization. Human beings are storytelling creatures. We navigate the complexity of existence by constructing narratives that help us make sense of our experiences and predict future events. But this powerful cognitive tool becomes a dangerous weapon when we allow isolated incidents to represent universal truths, a logical error known as hasty generalization. The hasty generalization fallacy occurs when we draw broad conclusions from insufficient evidence, typically from a single example or a small, unrepresentative sample. It's the intellectual equivalent of trying to understand the ocean by examining a single drop of water, or attempting to comprehend human nature by meeting just one person. This fallacy taps into one of the most fundamental aspects of human cognition, our pattern recognition system. Our brains are evolutionarily wired to quickly identify potential threats and opportunities based on limited information. In prehistoric environments, the cost of missing a pattern could be death, while the cost of seeing patterns that weren't really there was usually just wasted energy. This asymmetrical risk structure programmed us to err on the side of overgeneralization rather than undergeneralization. But what served us well in small tribal groups creates systematic problems in complex modern societies. When we encounter a member of an unfamiliar group behaving in a particular way, our ancient pattern recognition system immediately begins constructing generalizations about what those people are like. Single news stories about crimes committed by members of particular ethnic groups get unconsciously extrapolated into beliefs about entire populations. One negative interaction with a customer service representative gets generalized into sweeping judgments about entire companies or industries. The digital age has supercharged hasty generalization through what researchers call availability bias, our tendency to judge the frequency of events based on how easily we can remember examples. Social media and news outlets have powerful incentives to share the most dramatic and unusual stories because they generate more engagement. But this means our information environment is systematically skewed toward exceptional cases rather than typical ones. The result is a world where our understanding of reality becomes increasingly distorted by vivid but unrepresentative examples. Airplane crashes receive massive media coverage despite being extraordinarily rare, leading many people to overestimate the dangers of flying. Violent crimes get extensive news attention, creating the impression that society is becoming more dangerous even during periods when crime rates are actually declining. Hasty generalization becomes particularly dangerous when it interacts with confirmation bias, our tendency to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs while ignoring contradictory evidence. Once we've formed a generalization based on limited evidence, we become more likely to notice and remember future examples that support our conclusion while overlooking or dismissing examples that contradict it. The fallacy also exploits our desire for cognitive efficiency. Detailed, nuanced understanding requires significant mental effort, while simple generalizations can be stored and applied with minimal cognitive cost. In a world of information overload, hasty generalizations offer the appealing promise of understanding complex phenomena without having to invest in deep analysis. Social media algorithms have created echo chambers that amplify hasty generalization by ensuring that we're primarily exposed to information that confirms our existing prejudices. When our feeds are filled with carefully curated examples that support our generalizations while filtering out contradictory evidence, it becomes increasingly difficult to recognize that our conclusions are based on biased samples. Perhaps most tragically, hasty generalization contributes to the polarization and tribalism that plague modern discourse. When we allow single examples to represent entire groups of people, we lose the capacity for nuanced understanding of complex social and political issues. The world becomes divided into simple categories of good and evil, us and them, based on whatever limited evidence happens to be most readily available in our particular information bubbles. Slippery slope. The slippery slope fallacy imagines catastrophe in every first step. It sees apocalypse in adjustment, revolution in reform. This fallacy transforms reasonable proposals into harbingers of doom, insisting that one small change must inevitably cascade into complete societal collapse. The argument abandons logic for prophecy, evidence for speculation. The pattern follows predictable tracks. Someone suggests a minor change, perhaps allowing students to use calculators during certain math tests. The slippery slope advocate springs into action. First calculators, then computers doing all the work, then students who cannot perform basic arithmetic, then a generation unable to think, then the collapse of technological civilization. Each link in this chain seems plausible in isolation, but the inevitability of the progression remains pure fiction. Marriage equality debates showcase this fallacy in its full glory. Legal recognition of same-sex partnerships would lead, opponents insisted, to people marrying animals, buildings, multiple partners simultaneously. Society would crumble, families would disintegrate, children would suffer immeasurable harm. Decades later, in countries with marriage equality, none of these prophecies materialized. The slope proved neither slippery nor steep. The fallacy gains power from our pattern-seeking brains. We excel at imagining sequences, at projecting trends forward. This ability helped our species survive, letting us predict seasonal changes and animal migrations. But it also makes us vulnerable to those who paint disaster scenarios with compelling but unfounded certainty. We see the first domino and cannot help but envision all of them falling. The real world resists slippery slopes through friction laws, social norms, practical limitations, human agency. Society possesses countless mechanisms to prevent runaway changes. But the slippery slope argument ignores these breaks, these course corrections. It assumes passive victims riding helplessly toward doom rather than active agents capable of stopping, adjusting, or reversing course when needed. Composition fallacy. The composition fallacy assumes that what applies to parts must apply to the whole. If each component possesses a quality, surely their combination must possess it too. This seemingly logical leap leads us astray repeatedly, from economics to engineering, from sociology to sports. The whole emerges as something different from its parts, but this fallacy blinds us to that emergence. Economic policy falls victim to composition fallacies regularly. If one person saves money, they become wealthier. Therefore, if everyone saves simultaneously, society becomes wealthier. But when everyone stops spending, demand collapses, businesses fail, unemployment soars. The paradox of thrift demonstrates how individual virtue becomes collective catastrophe. What works for one fails for all. Sports teams demonstrate this fallacy's limits. Assembling the best individual players doesn't guarantee the best team. 5 supreme scorers might lose to 5 moderate players who understand teamwork. The composition fallacy suggests that excellence plus excellence equals greater excellence, but chemistry, coordination, and complementary skills matter more than individual brilliance. The whole requires different qualities than the parts. Urban planning suffered from composition fallacies for decades. If one highway reduces travel time, then many highways must reduce it proportionally. Cities built more roads to eliminate congestion, only to discover that more roads induced more driving. The traffic increased to fill the available space. The individual solution became the collective problem, but the composition fallacy prevented planners from seeing this paradox. The fallacy blinds us to emergent properties, qualities that arise from interaction rather than addition. Consciousness emerges from neurons that aren't themselves conscious. Culture emerges from individuals who don't contain culture in isolation. Beauty emerges from arrangements of ordinary materials. The composition fallacy makes us miss these emergent phenomena, looking for qualities in parts that only exist in wholes. Appeal to tradition. The appeal to tradition fallacy mistakes longevity for legitimacy, permanence for propriety. It argues that established practices deserve continuation simply because they're established, that age validates ideas. This fallacy transforms temporal accident into moral imperative, treating the familiar as the correct. It binds us to the past through logic that would freeze all progress at arbitrary points. Medicine suffered centuries under tradition's tyranny. Bloodletting persisted for 2,000 years, its longevity protecting it from scrutiny. Physicians defended the practice by citing its ancient pedigree rather than its medical merit. Hippocrates did it. Galen endorsed it. Generations of healers employed it. Surely such historical consensus couldn't be wrong. The appeal to tradition killed countless patients who might have survived without traditional treatment. Social institutions wrapped themselves in tradition's armor. Marriage operated one way for centuries, so that way must be right. Voting excluded certain groups historically, so inclusion becomes suspicious innovation. The workplace followed certain patterns for generations, making change seem unnatural. The appeal to tradition transforms historical accident into cosmic necessity, temporary arrangements into eternal requirements. Educational systems particularly suffer from this fallacy. Teaching methods persist because that's how it's always been done. Curricula remain unchanged because previous generations learned this way. The 3-month summer break continues despite its agricultural origins becoming irrelevant. Students suffer through ineffective traditional approaches while evidence-based innovations get rejected for their novelty. Tradition trumps efficacy. The fallacy gains strength from our psychological comfort with familiarity. The known feels safer than the unknown, even when the known causes demonstrable harm. We prefer familiar problems to unfamiliar solutions. The devil we know seems friendlier than the angel we don't. This emotional attachment to tradition disguises itself as logical argument, but comfort and correctness share no necessary connection. Moralistic Fallacy. The moralistic fallacy reverses the relationship between is and ought, insisting that the world must be as we wish it were. It argues from how things should be to claims about how things are. This fallacy transforms moral desires into empirical claims, ethical positions into factual assertions. Reality gets conscripted to serve morality, rather than morality responding to reality. Social science research suffers when the moralistic fallacy influences investigation. Researchers who believe inequality shouldn't exist might resist finding genuine differences between groups. Those who think certain behaviors shouldn't have genetic components might dismiss biological evidence. The moral commitment to equality becomes an empirical commitment to sameness. The fallacy corrupts research by making moral conclusions dictate empirical findings. Criminal justice debates showcase this fallacy regularly. Some argue that because punishment should rehabilitate, it does rehabilitate. Others insist that because deterrence ought to work, it must work. The moral position about what criminal justice should accomplish becomes an empirical claim about what it does accomplish. Evidence gets filtered through moral lenses, accepting what confirms our shoulds and rejecting what doesn't. Medical discussions fall into moralistic reasoning. The belief that natural remedies should be safer leads to claims that they are safer. The feeling that expensive treatments shouldn't work better becomes assertion that they don't work better. The moral intuition about how medicine ought to operate transforms into claims about how it does operate. The fallacy makes our preferences into facts, our values into verities. Environmental debates exemplify the moralistic fallacy's bipartisan appeal. Some environmentalists argue that because humans shouldn't be separate from nature, we aren't that. Indigenous peoples must live in harmony because that's how people should live. Some opponents argue that because environmental regulations shouldn't hurt the economy, they don't. Both sides let their moral positions dictate their factual claims. The Prosecutors Fallacy. The Prosecutors Fallacy inverts conditional probabilities, confusing the probability of evidence given guilt with the probability of guilt given evidence. This mathematical misunderstanding has sent innocent people to prison, destroyed reputations, and perverted justice. The fallacy thrives in courtrooms where statistics meet emotion, where numbers confront narratives. It transforms rare matches into proof of guilt through statistical sleight of hand. DNA evidence provides the classic case. The prosecutor declares that only 1 person in 10 million would match this DNA profile. The jury hears this as overwhelming proof. Surely the defendant must be guilty with odds of 10 million to 1. But this reverses the actual question. The relevant probability isn't how many people match, but given a match, what's the probability of innocence? In a city of 20 million, 2 people would match. The defendant might be either one. Medical diagnosis suffers from this fallacy repeatedly. A test for a rare disease shows 99% accuracy. A positive result seems conclusive, 99% chance of having the disease. But if the disease affects 1 in 10,000, and you test 1 million people, you'll get roughly 10,000 false positives, and only 100 true positives. The positive test actually indicates less than 1% chance of disease. The prosecutor's fallacy makes rare conditions seem common. Unlikely events seem certain. Financial fraud detection systems embody this error systematically. The algorithm flags unusual transactions with high accuracy. 95% of flagged transactions in training data were fraudulent. But actual fraud is rare. When applied to millions of normal transactions, the system floods investigators with false positives. Each flag seems significant because of the high accuracy rate, but most flags indicate normal behavior. The fallacy transforms statistical precision into practical uselessness. The fallacy persists because conditional probability confuses even educated minds. We naturally think symmetrically: if A implies B, then B implies A. But probability doesn't work this way. The probability of rain given clouds differs vastly from the probability of clouds given rain. The prosecutor's fallacy exploits this cognitive weakness, presenting one conditional probability while the jury needs its inverse. Mathematics becomes a weapon against justice through this simple inversion. The Conjunction Fallacy. The Conjunction Fallacy reveals our preference for detailed stories over probable truths. It occurs when we rate specific, detailed scenarios as more likely than general ones that encompass them. The human mind finds elaborate narratives more believable than simple statements, even when basic probability theory proves this impossible. No specific version can be more probable than the general category containing it. Psychological experiments expose this fallacy starkly. Participants read about Linda, a philosophy major concerned with social justice. They then ranked probabilities. Linda is a bank teller, or Linda is a bank teller active in the feminist movement. Most ranked the detailed description as more probable, violating basic logic. Every feminist bank teller is necessarily a bank teller, making the conjunction necessarily less probable. But the specific story feels more real than the general category. Intelligence assessments fall prey to conjunction fallacies constantly. Analysts construct elaborate scenarios involving multiple coordinated actors, complex motivations, intricate timing. These detailed narratives seem more credible than simple alternatives. The possibility that multiple unlikely events coincide seems more plausible than boring general explanations. Wars have started from conjunction fallacies, seeing coordinated attacks where random events occurred. Investment strategies suffer when this fallacy guides decisions. The specific scenario where technology stocks rise while interest rates fall during a democratic administration seems more likely than the general markets go up. Investors construct elaborate conditional predictions that feel insightful but violate probability. The more conditions added to a prediction, the less likely it becomes, but the more convincing it sounds. The fallacy succeeds because our brains evolve to process stories, not statistics. A detailed narrative activates our simulation systems. We can envision it happening. The general statement remains abstract, harder to imagine. Evolution didn't prepare us for formal probability theory. It prepared us to remember and share specific scenarios that might threaten or benefit our tribe. The conjunction fallacy represents this narrative preference, overwhelming mathematical logic. The continuum fallacy. The continuum fallacy denies distinctions because boundaries prove fuzzy. It argues that if you cannot identify the precise point where something becomes something else, then no real difference exists between them. This fallacy transforms gradual transitions into proof that categories lack meaning. It weaponizes continuity against classification, using smooth spectrums to deny obvious differences. Color perception demonstrates this fallacy's appeal. Where exactly does red become orange, orange become yellow? No precise wavelength marks these transitions. The continuum fallacy concludes that color distinctions are therefore meaningless, that red and yellow are identical because we cannot pinpoint where one becomes the other. Yet traffic lights function, artists paint, and everyone distinguishes roses from sunflowers despite the continuous spectrum. Ethical debates drown in continuum fallacies. At what precise moment does a fetus become a person deserving rights? When exactly does end-of-life care become euthanasia? The inability to identify exact transition points gets presented as proof that no meaningful distinctions exist. The fallacy transforms difficult line drawing into impossible category making. It pretends that because boundaries are complex, they don't exist. Wealth discussions exemplify this confusion. At what exact income does someone become rich? $100,000. $101? The continuum fallacy argues that without a precise cutoff, rich and poor are meaningless categories. But Bill Gates and a minimum wage worker clearly occupy different economic realities. The smooth continuum of income doesn't eliminate the meaningful distinction between abundance and poverty. The fallacy particularly corrupts policy discussions requiring thresholds. Speed limits, age restrictions, tax brackets, all require drawing lines on continuums. The continuum fallacy attacks every such line as arbitrary and therefore invalid, but necessity requires choices even when precision proves impossible. The absence of perfect boundaries doesn't eliminate the need for practical distinctions. The fallacy demands impossible precision to acknowledge obvious differences. The Ludic Fallacy. The Ludic Fallacy mistakes the neat randomness of games for the wild uncertainty of reality. Named from the Latin for game, it assumes real-world probabilities behave like casino dice, clean, calculable, contained. This fallacy transforms messy reality into tidy models, complex uncertainty into simple risk. It makes us confident in predictions that rest on foundations of oversimplification. Financial models exemplify ludic thinking catastrophically. Risk managers calculate value at risk using normal distributions, historical correlations, clean assumptions. They treat market uncertainty like roulette wheels, random but bounded, unpredictable but parametered. Then reality delivers events their models deemed impossible. The 2008 crisis arrived as a 2.5 standard deviation event, supposedly occurring once per several universes worth of time. The models were wrong, not reality. Insurance operates on ludic assumptions until it doesn't. Actuaries price policies using historical frequencies, assuming future risks resemble past patterns. They model hurricanes like dice rolls, random but following known distributions. Climate change breaks their models. Cyber risks defy actuarial tables. Pandemics arrive from outside their probability spaces. The Ludic Fallacy made them mistake historical patterns for universal laws. Sports analytics increasingly suffers from ludic thinking. Analysts reduce athletic performance to probability distributions, treating games like repeatable experiments. They calculate win probabilities to decimal precision, expected goals to hundredths. But sports contain psychology, momentum, weather, injuries, wild uncertainties that resist modeling. The greatest upsets come from factors outside the models, from the aspects of reality that refuse to behave like dice. The fallacy appeals because games provide our primary experience with randomness. We understand dice, cards, lottery balls. These become our templates for thinking about uncertainty everywhere. But real randomness rarely follows game-like rules. It includes unknown unknowns, black swans, systemic shifts that change the rules themselves. The ludic fallacy makes us overconfident in our models, underprepared for reality's wilder uncertainties. The Motte and Bailey Fallacy. The Motte and Bailey Fallacy employs medieval defensive architecture as rhetorical strategy. Like a castle with an easily defended stone, keep, Motte, and a valuable but vulnerable courtyard, Bailey. This fallacy switches between modest, defensible claims and bold, controversial ones depending on pressure. Under attack, retreat to the Motte. When safe, occupy the Bailey. The alternation makes extreme positions seem reasonable through association with moderate ones. Academic discourse perfected this technique. A scholar makes sweeping claims about society, knowledge, or human nature, occupying the Bailey. When challenged, they retreat to the Motte. I'm merely suggesting we should question assumptions, or I'm just starting conversations. Once criticism passes, they return to the Bailey, making the same sweeping claims. The modest position provides cover for the radical one. Political movements employ Motte and Bailey tactics instinctively. The Bailey contains revolution, fundamental transformation, radical restructuring. When challenged, retreat to the Motte of incremental reform, reasonable adjustment, common sense change. The movement seems moderate when defending, extreme when advancing. Supporters can choose which version to embrace. Critics struggle to pin down what's actually being proposed. Corporate marketing mastered this duality. The Bailey promises transformation. This product will change your life, revolutionize your industry, disrupt everything. When regulators or critics approach, retreat to the Motte we're just offering. Marginally improved functionality, slightly better efficiency, modest enhancement. The company operates from the Bailey while defending from the Motte. The fallacy succeeds through strategic ambiguity. Participants genuinely might not realize they're switching positions. The exciting Bailey and defensive Motte blur together in their minds. They believe themselves consistent while alternating between incompatible claims. Critics appear to attack strawmen when addressing the Bailey, seem pedantic when challenging the Motte. The fallacy makes its practitioners impossible to pin down. their positions too slippery to grasp. The Etymological Fallacy. The etymological fallacy insists that words must mean what they originally meant, that historical derivation determines current definition. It treats language as fossil rather than living system, etymology as destiny rather than history. This fallacy weaponizes word origins against contemporary usage, demanding that ancient roots override modern meanings. Political arguments frequently deploy etymological ammunition. Democracy derives from Greek words meaning people power. So, representatives making decisions becomes undemocratic by etymology. Republic comes from public matter, so any private involvement corrupts republican government. The fallacy pretends that ancient Greeks and Romans determined forever what political systems must entail. Current usage becomes incorrect by historical precedent. Scientific terminology suffers etymological confusion. Atom means indivisible in Greek, yet we split atoms routinely. Oxygen means acid former, but many acids contain no oxygen. Should we abandon atomic theory because atoms divide? Rename oxygen because etymology misleads. The etymological fallacy says yes, that words must match their origins or lose legitimacy. Science would collapse under such linguistic fundamentalism. Social discussions get derailed by etymological appeals. Someone notes that husband originally meant house owner, that wife meant simply woman. These origins become arguments about modern marriage, as if medieval etymology should determine contemporary relationships. The words evolved, their meanings shifted, but the fallacy treats original meaning as true meaning. Living language gets murdered by dead etymology. The fallacy particularly corrupts discussions about discrimination and prejudice. Someone discovers that a term originally had innocent origins, then declares current offensive usage invalid. Or they find problematic etymology in common words and demand their abandonment. The fallacy goes both directions, using etymology to defend the indefensible or attack the acceptable. It makes word origins into moral arguments, historical accidents into ethical imperatives. The Bulverism Fallacy. Bulverism assumes someone is wrong, then explains why they're wrong, without ever demonstrating the initial error, named by C.S. Lewis after an imaginary inventor. This fallacy skips the work of refutation and proceeds directly to psychological explanation. It treats disagreement as pathology, requiring diagnosis rather than position requiring engagement. Political discourse drowns in bulveristic dismissal. Opponents don't hold different views, they suffer from psychological conditions. They vote wrongly because of fear, ignorance, manipulation, or moral failure. The bulverist never proves the position wrong, just explains why someone would hold such obviously wrong views. The actual arguments never get addressed, only the assumed psychological motivations behind them. Academic debates increasingly resort to bulverism. Scholars don't refute opposing theories, they psychoanalyze why someone would propose them. The theory must stem from privilege, from marginalization, from career ambition, from personal trauma. The actual merits never get discussed. The bulverist knows the conclusion is wrong and only needs to explain the pathology that produced it. Relationship arguments exemplify everyday bulverism. Partners don't address each other's actual points but explain why the other would say such things. You only think that because of your mother, your ex, your insecurities. The complaint itself never gets evaluated, only the assumed psychological source. The bulverism makes every disagreement into therapy, every argument into diagnosis. The fallacy appeals because explanation feels like refutation. Understanding why someone believes something false seems to prove it's false. But genesis doesn't determine validity. Someone might believe true things for bad reasons, false things for good reasons. The source of belief and its truth value remain logically independent. Bulverism collapses this distinction, making psychological explanation substitute for logical refutation. The Kafkatrapping Fallacy. Kafkatrapping makes denial evidence of guilt, resistance proof of the accusation. Named after Franz Kafka's nightmarish legal proceedings, this fallacy creates unfalsifiable accusations where protestation only confirms culpability. The trap snaps shut regardless of response, admit guilt or prove it through denial. Social justice discussions sometimes employ Kafka traps. Denying prejudice becomes evidence of prejudice, only the prejudiced would deny it. Claiming innocence proves guilt. The truly innocent would acknowledge their complicity. The accused cannot escape because the trap interprets every response as confirmation. Acceptance validates the charge. Denial demonstrates its truth. Workplace training sessions can become Kafka-trapping exercises. Questioning the training proves you need it most. Suggesting the problem isn't severe shows you're part of it. Agreement might be insincere. Disagreement definitely proves the problem. The trap makes engagement impossible. Every response reinforces the predetermined conclusion. Conspiracy theories often employ Kafka-trapping logic. Demanding evidence becomes suspicious. Why would you need proof unless you're involved? Skepticism reveals complicity. Only someone with something to hide would question. The absence of evidence becomes evidence of cover-up. The Kafka trap makes the conspiracy unfalsifiable. Every challenge strengthening belief. The fallacy's power comes from its psychological sophistication. It exploits our knowledge that guilty people often deny guilt, that those with problems often don't recognize them. These truths become weapons when universalized. The Kafka trap removes the possibility of innocence, makes every behavior suspicious. It creates philosophical checkmates where the accused loses regardless of moves made. The historian's fallacy. The historian's fallacy projects present knowledge into past decisions, judging historical actors by information they couldn't have possessed. It assumes that what seems obvious now was obvious then, that decisions makers should have known what only hindsight reveals. This fallacy transforms history into a series of incomprehensible blunders by people who mysteriously ignored obvious facts, facts that were only obvious later. Military historians commit this fallacy routinely. Generals should have known the attack would fail, the invasion would bog down, the technology would change warfare. The criticism assumes commanders possessed our knowledge of outcomes, technologies, and consequences. The generals who dismissed machine guns as irrelevant seem foolish only because we know what machine guns became. In their present, with their information, the dismissal made sense. Investment analysis thrives on historians' fallacy. Everyone should have bought Apple stock in 1997, sold before the 2008 crash, recognized Bitcoin's potential in 2010. The fallacy forgets that thousands of companies looked like early Apple and failed, that people predicted crashes every year that didn't happen, that countless digital currencies preceded Bitcoin into oblivion. Today's obvious winners were yesterday's uncertain gambles. Medical judgment suffers retrospective distortion. Doctors should have caught the rare disease, recognized the unusual presentation, tried the treatment that eventually worked. The historian's fallacy ignores that symptoms suggested common conditions, that presentations matched typical patterns, that the successful treatment contradicted established practice. The diagnosis seems obvious only after we know it. The fallacy corrupts our self-understanding. We believe we always knew our spouse was perfect, our career was destined, our beliefs were inevitable. But memory reconstructs rather than records. We edit our past selves to align with present knowledge, creating false continuity. The historian's fallacy makes us strangers to our former selves, unable to understand why we ever thought or chose differently. The Genetic Fallacy. The Genetic Fallacy judges ideas by their origins rather than their merits, dismissing or accepting claims based on source rather than substance. It assumes that where something comes from determines what it's worth, that genesis determines validity. This fallacy makes pedigree into proof, ancestry into argument. Scientific discoveries get dismissed through genetic fallacies. Wegener proposed continental drift, but he was a meteorologist, not a geologist, therefore wrong. Mendel discovered genetics, but he was just a monk ignored for decades. The fallacy evaluates the messenger's credentials rather than the message's evidence. Truth becomes contingent on the right source rather than right reasoning. Philosophical arguments face genetic dismissal constantly. That philosophy emerged from privileged circumstances, therefore, it's invalid. That idea came from a problematic person. Therefore, it's wrong. That concept originated in oppressive societies. Therefore, it's worthless. The genetic fallacy makes ideas guilty by association, contaminated by context. It forgets that truth can emerge from anywhere, that even broken clocks are right twice daily. Modern technology discussions exemplify genetic confusion. The internet emerged from military research, therefore it's inherently militaristic. Smartphones derive from corporate capitalism, therefore they embody capitalist values. The genetic fallacy treats origins as destiny, sources as essence. It ignores how technologies transform through use, how purposes shift from original intentions. The fallacy particularly poisons political discourse. Ideas get endorsed or rejected based on which party proposed them, not their actual merit. The same policy becomes brilliant or terrible depending on its political genesis. Voters support or oppose based on source rather than substance. The genetic fallacy transforms politics into pure tribalism, where origins matter more than outcomes. The sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy chains us to past investments, making previous expenditure determine future decisions. It treats irretrievable costs as relevant to current choices, letting bygone resources dictate ongoing allocation. This fallacy transforms history into destiny, making what we've already lost control and what we might still save. Warfare exemplifies sunk cost thinking catastrophically. Thousands have died taking this objective. We cannot abandon it now. Their sacrifice would be meaningless if we withdraw. So more die for the same worthless ground, honoring sunk costs with fresh casualties. The previous losses become arguments for continued losses. The fallacy demands we throw good lives after bad, compounding rather than cutting losses. Relationships suffer sunk cost imprisonment. Couples stay together because they've already invested years, not because those years were good or future years look better. The time already spent becomes reason to spend more time. The misery already endured justifies enduring more misery. The sunk cost fallacy makes duration into obligation, transforming past investment into future commitment regardless of current reality. Business projects exemplify escalating commitment. Millions already spent on the failing project cancellation would waste that investment. So millions more follow, protecting the sunk costs that are already gone regardless. Companies pursue doomed strategies because abandoning them acknowledges loss. The fallacy makes admitting error more expensive than continuing error. Education and career choices get distorted by sunk costs. Students complete degrees they hate because they've already invested years. Professionals stay in miserable careers because of previous training. The time and money already spent, irretrievably gone, determine future time and money allocation. The sunk cost fallacy makes our past selves tyrants over our present selves, our former choices dictators of current options. The Spotlight Fallacy. The Spotlight Fallacy mistakes visible examples for representative samples, assuming that what receives attention reflects what exists. It treats media coverage as statistical sampling, newsworthiness as frequency. This fallacy transforms the exceptional into the expected, the remarkable into the routine. Crime perception demonstrates spotlight distortion perfectly. Spectacular crimes dominate news coverage, creating impression of constant danger. The thousands of safe days pass unnoticed while the one violent incident gets endless attention. Neighborhoods seem dangerous because we hear about crimes, not non-crimes. The spotlight fallacy makes the rare seem common through disproportionate visibility. Economic understanding suffers spotlight bias. Lottery winners and startup billionaires get profiled endlessly. The millions of lottery losers and failed startups remain invisible. Success stories fill business magazines while failure statistics hide in footnotes. The spotlight shines on exceptions, making them seem like rules. Everyone knows someone who got rich quick. Nobody talks about everyone else. Social media amplifies spotlight distortion exponentially. The most extreme voices get the most engagement, making them seem representative. The radical positions, the outrageous takes, The controversial stands dominate feeds. Moderate opinions generate no clicks. Reasonable positions inspire no shares. The Spotlight Fallacy makes us think everyone holds extreme views because extreme views are all we see. Scientific communication particularly suffers from spotlight selection. Revolutionary studies get headlines while replications get ignored. Positive results get published while null results disappear. Breakthroughs receive attention while incremental progress proceeds invisibly. The Spotlight Fallacy makes science seem like constant revolution rather than careful accumulation. The No True Scotsman Fallacy. The No True Scotsman Fallacy protects beliefs from counterexamples by retroactively redefining categories. When evidence contradicts a universal claim, this fallacy doesn't abandon the claim, it expels the evidence from the category. The definition shifts to exclude inconvenient examples, maintaining the generalization by gerrymandering its scope. Religious discussions employ this fallacy reflexively. Religious people are moral, but that religious person committed crimes. No true believer would do that, they weren't really religious. The category gets refined post hoc to exclude problematic members. The fallacy makes religious identity unfalsifiable, automatically excluding anyone whose behavior contradicts the claimed correlation. Political movements protect themselves through no true Scotsman reasoning. That socialist country failed economically, it wasn't true socialism. That capitalist country has poverty, it isn't true capitalism. Every failure gets expelled from the category, leaving only successes or potential futures. The fallacy makes ideologies immune to empirical refutation by endlessly refining definitions. Professional fields maintain prestige through this fallacy. Scientists are objective, but that scientist let bias influence results. They weren't a true scientist. Journalists seek truth, but that journalist spread misinformation. Not a true journalist. The professions protect their self-image by excommunicating failures rather than acknowledging them. The category becomes aspirational rather than descriptive. Cultural identity discussions showcase this defensive redefinition. Members of a culture who act contrary to claimed cultural values get expelled from authentic membership. They've been corrupted, westernized, colonized, no longer truly part of the culture. The fallacy maintains cultural generalizations by excluding counterexamples rather than acknowledging diversity. It makes cultures monolithic by definition rather than observation. The Narrative Fallacy. The Narrative Fallacy imposes story structures on random sequences, creating meaningful plots from meaningless noise. It transforms correlation into causation by adding narrative glue, making coincidence into destiny through storytelling. This fallacy satisfies our hunger for meaning but distorts our understanding of causality and probability. Historical interpretation exemplifies narrative imposition. Wars get explained through inevitable conflicts, economic forces, great men's decisions. The messy contingency gets smoothed into coherent storylines. Alternative histories seem impossible because the narrative feels necessary. But contemporaries saw multiple possible futures where we see single inevitable past. The Narrative Fallacy transforms accident into destiny through retrospective storytelling. Personal biographies showcase narrative construction. Successful people's childhoods get reinterpreted as obvious precursors to later achievement. Every experience becomes preparation. Every choice becomes stepping stone. The random walk gets reconstructed as purposeful journey. Failed individuals' same experiences get narratized differently, early warning signs, missed opportunities, tragic flaws. The Narrative Fallacy makes any life story seem inevitable by selecting supportive details. Stock market analysis consists largely of narrative fallacies. Markets rise because of confidence, fall because of fear, move because of expectations. Analysts construct daily stories explaining random fluctuations. The same news explains rises or falls depending on market direction. The narrative provides comfort, someone understands what's happening. But the stories are post hoc constructions, not causal explanations. The Narrative Fallacy transforms noise into signal through storytelling. Scientific progress gets narratized misleadingly. Discoveries seem inevitable, building logically toward truth. The false starts, lucky accidents, Personal feuds disappear from clean storylines. Newton's apple becomes mythology. Darwin's finches become destiny. The narrative fallacy makes scientific progress seem planned rather than stumbling, logical rather than lucky. It removes the randomness that characterizes actual discovery. The regression fallacy. The regression fallacy misinterprets regression to the mean as meaningful change rather than statistical inevitability. It sees improvement after punishment and decay after praise, attributing to intervention what statistics would predict regardless. This fallacy makes us confident in useless treatments, pointless punishments, and counterproductive practices. Sports coaching embodies regression, confusion. A player performs terribly and gets screamed at, next game improves. The coach believes yelling worked. But exceptional performances, good or bad, tend toward average regardless of intervention. The superstar game, followed by mediocrity, wasn't caused by praise, making them soft. The terrible game, followed by improvement, wasn't fixed by criticism. Regression to the mean masquerades as coaching effect. Medical treatments benefit from regression illusion. Patients seek treatment when symptoms peak, they're worse than usual. Almost any intervention appears successful because symptoms naturally regress toward baseline. The treatment gets credit for statistical inevitability. Clinical trials require control groups precisely because regression fakes therapeutic effect. The fallacy has sustained useless treatments for millennia. Educational interventions showcase regression confusion. Students scoring lowest get special tutoring, then improve. The program seems successful, but lowest scorers included those having bad days, making lucky guesses, experiencing temporary difficulties. Their improvement toward normal performance gets attributed to intervention rather than regression. Meanwhile, highest scorers decline without intervention, regression again, not program absence. Business consultants exploit regression systematically. They arrive when performance is worst, why else hire consultants? Performance improves toward normal. Consultants claim credit. The regression fallacy makes every intervention seem successful when timed correctly. Companies pay millions for advice that regression would provide free. The fallacy transforms statistical artifact into expertise evidence.